Hey, what in the hell is happening with you and your face? You got a good mug there. What's going on with your face? Take care of your face. You've only got one, so don't fuck it up. You know what I'm saying? Don't do it. How are you? Nick Digilio here. How are you? Hey, check me out here on the YouTubes. Check me out on the Patreon. You want to help out, please do. The Patreon channel is the best way to do that. Patreon.com/NickDShow. Pick a tier, donate. $3, $6, $25 a month. Helps keep the videos going. You'll get exclusive content that nobody else gets. Become a patron now. It helps out. Seriously, it's a good thing. It helps, keeps things going. Donate today. It's a good thing. It'll make you feel better about yourself. Because, I mean, you feel like shit right now, don't you? Don't you? You do. Admit it. Donate. You'll feel much better about yourself. Patreon.com/NickDShow. Donate today. Pick a tier. Donate. Become a patron. And feel better about your life. Just do it, for Christ's sake. Hey, all right. My podcast. New episodes every Tuesday and Friday on the Radio Misfits Podcast Network. The best podcast network ever. RadioMisfits.com. The Nick D Podcast. So yesterday was the 52nd anniversary of the release of Black Sabbath's first album, the self-titled masterpiece, Black Sabbath. Was released on June 1st, 1970 in America. Came out a little bit earlier in the UK. But it was released in America on June 1st, 1970. 52 years ago yesterday. One of the greatest albums ever recorded. The blueprint, the definition of all heavy metal / hard rock that would follow or even precede it. One of the most important, groundbreaking, greatest albums by one of the greatest groups of all time was released. One of the finest examples of a debut album ever. Black Sabbath. It all begins and ends with Black Sabbath. Yesterday, June 1st. June 1st should annually be a national holiday. Because the first Black Sabbath album was released on June 1st. It should be a national holiday. Schools should be closed. There should be no mail. Everybody should get the day off. It should be a day of celebration. Everybody should have parties. It should be bigger than any national holiday ever. Because it's the day that Black Sabbath released their first album, changed music, and became, quite simply, the greatest band ever. So, one of the most important debut albums in the history of music, not hyperbole, fact! Anyway, yesterday, June 1st, 52nd anniversary of the release of Black Sabbath's first album, one of the greatest debut albums of all time. So I thought I'd talk about some of the best debut albums ever. And these are a bunch that I had thought of that I was like, okay, who had great debut albums? And historically, what were considered fantastic debut albums. Even if I don't love them, just historically and personally, what are the greatest debut albums of all time by artists? If you have a choice and you would like to leave them, leave it here on the YouTube channel in the comments section. What are the best debut albums of all time? More importantly, you can leave it at the Patreon. Leave the comments on the Patreon channel after you donate. Patreon.com/NickDShow. Donate today. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep fucking bugging you. $3. It ain't going to kill you. Patreon.com/NickDShow. So anyway, what are the best debut albums of all time? So I have my personal choices. Black Sabbath from 1970, obviously, being one of the singular moments in music history, and clearly one of the greatest debut albums of all time. But I have other ones here. Look Sharp, Joe Jackson, 1979. Joe Jackson, continues to be an amazing artist. Had a stretch there in the late 70s and up until like the mid to late 80s where like everything the guy did was fantastic. Great artist. Look Sharp, fantastic album. One of the best debut albums of all time. Elvis Presley, 1956. What can you say about that? That ranks way up there in terms of historic, in terms of importance. 1956 album. There's Elvis. Enjoy. And Elvis is obviously fucking Elvis. So yeah, Elvis Presley, 1956. Let's see. Paid in Full. Eric B. and Rakim from 1987. Eric B. and Rakim, or Rakim, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Paid in Full, fantastic hip-hop record. Landmark, influential, important. Eric B. and Rakim, one of the greatest duos in hip-hop, one of the greatest and most important artists in rap. 1987, back when hip-hop was great. That's the time. 86 to around 94. That's the swing of hip-hop. That's when I was into hip-hop. That's when hip-hop was great. And I know I'm the only person that believes this. The nail in the coffin of hip-hop for me was the release of The Chronic. It was all over after that. After The Chronic, every once in a while a good hip-hop record would come out. But since then, since The Chronic, everything has sounded the same. It's all just a repeat of the same horse shit. Featuring this person, featuring that person, featuring this person, a bunch of shit. Every once in a while you'll find a hip-hop artist that's doing something interesting now, but it's been a long stretch. I mean, between 86 and 94, those were the golden years for rap and hip-hop. Like, that's when the greatest stuff ever recorded by any rap or hip-hop artist was recorded between 86 and 94. After that, pa-plam! Dr. Dre's fault. Chronic, not a good record. Everything that came after it tried to sound like The Chronic, and now it's horse shit. Every once in a while, there's a terrific hip-hop artist out there, but it's few and far between, and it all is just the same. Artist this, featuring that, let's do this, let's do that. Fuck off. If you want to listen to hip-hop, you want to listen to the important rap and hip-hop, 86 to 94. Go back and listen to the artists then. When it was before The Chronic fucked everything up. And I know that's an unpopular opinion, but I don't care. Dr. Dre and The Chronic fucked up hip-hop. Sorry. But before that, incredible. And Eric B. and Rakim, or however you want to pronounce it, a great one. Are We Not Men? We Are Devo, 1978. One of the greatest debut albums of all time. Devo still rules. Yeah, that's a great one. That's an important one. Beauty and the Beat by the Go-Go's, 1981. Boom! Girl group burst upon the scene. First time I really heard them was when they opened up for the Police on their Ghost in the Machine tour. And I kind of heard them, but they opened for the Police on the Ghost in the Machine tour, and I'd seen the Police on that tour probably 3 or 4 times, and they were the opening act, and they were great. And I was like, oh, these girls rule. Beauty and the Beat, Go-Go's. Talking Heads, 77. From 1977, Talking Heads' first album. Lots of great songs on that. And, obviously one of the most important bands of all time, one of the great avant-garde bands of all time, part of the whole New York scene. And Talking Heads, 77. The Stooges, 1969, the Stooges album called The Stooges. Iggy Pop busting onto the scene. One of the most important, punk, neo-punk acts of all time. Stooges, an amazing debut album from 1969. Kill 'Em All, Metallica, 1983. Some people still think it's their best album. Like 40 years ago, almost. That record, God, 40 years. Metallica's first album came out almost 40 years ago. I'm old. But Kill 'Em All, Metallica, amazing record. Definitely Maybe, Oasis, I don't care. I love it, from 1994. I love Oasis, I make no apologies about it. Derivative, maybe, I don't know. Little Too Much Ego, yes, absolutely. Is it fun to watch the Gallagher brothers beat the shit out of each other and make fun of each other and fight constantly? Absolutely. I love Oasis. No apology. You think they're derivative? Fine. Whatever. I don't care. Definitely Maybe is a terrific record, and Oasis is great, and that's a great debut album. Marquee Moon, Television, from 1977, one of the most influential and important records of that time. Great band, great punk band, and that album continues to influence records today. From 1977, so Marquee Moon by Television. 3 Feet High and Rising, De La Soul from 1989. Again, good hip-hop, great hip-hop, not shit hip-hop like today. I mean, listen to that record. Listen to 3 Feet High and Rising, and then listen to any portion. Take the best hip-hop from now. Take the best hip-hop post-1994, and I'm including Chronic, and compare it to 3 Feet High and Rising. You can't, because it's incomparable. The shit that's coming out today is nonsense, especially compared to De La Soul's first record, 3 Feet High and Rising. My Aim is True, Elvis Costello, 1977. Phenomenal debut record. You want to talk about an artist that bursts onto the screen with a lot of potency and energy and urgency. Elvis Costello fucking rules, has ruled, has changed, has done so many different kinds of things, and does everything well. He's one of the best artists of all time, and My Aim is True is one of the best debut albums of all time. Well, I mean, Please Please Me, The Beatles, 1963. You know, I mean, it's weird because, like, you have to, like, look at what was the debut album in America and other parts of the world, and what was the debut album in the UK. You know, the Beatles UK versus US releases, you know, it gets a little, you know, it's like, what album was this? They had a different title, it came out at a different time, you know, and all that stuff. So it gets a little confusing, you know, like as to what is the title, when did it come out, all that stuff. But Please Please Me by the Beatles, you know, that's the one where they're looking over the, you know, the edge of the balcony. Anyway, that 1963, well, you can't argue that. I mean, it's the Beatles, for Christ's sake. The Pretenders' first album, 1980. Chrissie Hynde, perhaps the coolest chick in the history of rock and roll. Coolest chick in the history of rock and roll, Chrissie Hynde. Out of Ohio, The Pretenders, great band. Chrissie Hynde continues to be crazy and awesome. But that first Pretenders album from 1980, not a bad track on it. Every single song on that album is great. Phenomenal. Burst onto the scene. Pretenders, 1980. Great debut album. Nevermind the Bollocks, here's the Sex Pistols, 1977. What can you say about the Sex Pistols? I mean, you know, great debut album, changed music in a lot of ways, made a massive statement about the music from that time period, what was happening in popular music with, you know, the corporate FM rock and the disco, and then all of a sudden, Sex Pistols, who don't know 3 chords, show up and change the face of music. Again, let's go back to hip-hop in its heyday from 1988 when hip-hop was great. Straight Outta Compton, NWA. You know, what are you going to say about that, man? You know, the introduction of all these guys, including Dr. Dre, who would go on to ruin hip-hop with an album. But you got Eazy-E, you got Ice Cube. You know, I mean, it's a phenomenal record, made a massive statement, came out at a time in 1988 when hip-hop was vital and new and important. And one of the greatest debut albums of all time, Straight Outta Compton, NWA. Speaking of, let's go right back to hip-hop again. Yo Bum Rush the Show, P.E.'s first album, 1987. Might not be their best album, but it was certainly an amazing debut album. Again, 1987, we're talking about, like, at that period, 87 to around 94. For my money, hip-hop was the most interesting and the best and the kind of the most important genre out there. And Yo Bum Rush the Show, an amazing debut album from Public Enemy. The Ramones, 1976. Come on. It's the Ramones. One of the greatest bands of all time. The debut album, not a bad cut on it. The Ramones, 1976. Great debut album. Going back to hip-hop again, 1986. License to Ill, the Beastie Boys. Not one of my favorite Beastie Boys albums, but an important record. Historically, and in terms of making a statement. Everybody hated the Beastie Boys got booed off of Madonna's. You know, she was like, I want the Beastie Boys to open for me. This was at Madonna, like, well, I mean, she's always been huge, but this was like right at almost the pinnacle, the top of Madonna's popularity when she first really burst on the screen and was everywhere, MTV, everywhere, selling millions of records. And she chose the Beastie Boys to open for her, and they got booed off the stage constantly. But License to Ill, Beastie Boys, very incredibly memorable debut album. A lot of people would say Appetite for Destruction, Guns N' Roses, 1987. It's an important record historically. I fucking hate Guns N' Roses, and I wouldn't include, the only list that I would include Appetite for Destruction on is either shittiest album or most overrated album. I can't stand Guns N' Roses. I've never liked them, never will never understand the popularity and why people are so rabid about them. Axl Rose has an awful voice, and he's one of the biggest asshole pricks in the history of music. I've never found their stuff. You know, I could go back and everybody talks about other artists being derivative. Everything that Guns N' Roses did, everything they did, somebody did before them and much, much better, and without one of the shittiest vocalists of all time singing. And Axl Rose is one of the shittiest vocalists of all time. But historically, if you're talking debut albums, Appetite for Destruction was huge. It was massive. Most people love it. I think it's shit, but it sold millions and millions of copies, and they blew up big time. So yeah, reluctantly, I have to include Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction when you're talking about debut albums. Other great debut albums, and these are the ones that I kind of really like, that I think are important. Madonna's first album from 1983. Again, this was back when she was an interesting artist doing dance stuff, mostly written by other people, mostly produced by other people. She was more of an image at that point. She didn't really become an artist in and of herself until Like a Prayer came out. So it took a few years. When Like a Prayer came out, it was like, oh wait, what's going on here? I liked Madonna. I thought she was fine. She was, like poppy, dance queen kind of thing. She made people dance. The music was very kind of throwaway and poppy, like on the first album. There's great stuff on the first album. But it wasn't until Like a Prayer when Madonna became Madonna, when she became an artist, when she started writing her own songs, picking her own themes, picking her producers, being a part of the making of all the albums, and all that stuff. But the first Madonna record, I love it, and it's important, from 1983. Number one record by Big Star from 1972, one of the greatest pop rock bands of all time. Alex Chilton, for Christ's sake. Big Star, an amazing band, number one record, not a bad cut on it, one of the greatest debut albums of all time. Zeppelin 1, what can you say? Zeppelin 1, my favorite Zeppelin album is the next one, which would be Zeppelin 2, but Zeppelin 1 from 1969, what can you say, man? Sonically, they ripped off all the blues guys. Yes, they did, but what Page and Plant and Bonham and John Paul Jones did is legendary, and the first Zeppelin album is one of the greatest debut albums of all time. One of the greatest and most important debut albums of all time is the first Zeppelin album. And only a year later, Sabbath would come out. So within months, you got Led Zeppelin's first album. Like 5 months later, Sabbath's first album come out. Music changed. Two of the greatest, most important records ever in the history of music. Defining records. Zeppelin, Sabbath, within 5 months of each other. Amazing. Exile in Guyville, Liz Phair's first album. I mean, what can you say about Liz Phair? Being from Chicago, being, an active member of that scene when that record came out, hanging out in the clubs and running into Liz Phair in Wicker Park every once in a while. No, Exile in Guyville, one of the greatest debut albums of all time. Liz Phair rules. I'm 56, pushing 50. I'll be 57 in a month or so, and Liz Phair. That was like in my 20s. Liz Phair. I don't know a guy from Chicago who wasn't in love with Liz Phair after that record came out, and she's one of the greatest artists ever. I love her. And Exile in Guyville, one of the greatest debut albums of all time. Let's see, 10 by Pearl Jam. You got it in 1991. Influential. Came at a time when music was changing. The whole alternative grunge thing. If you want to talk about that, let's talk about that. Dinosaur Jr., whose documentary I just saw, Freak Scene at Music Box the other night, which was terrific. Their first album came out in '88. So like right around that time, I loved the whole, whatever it became grunge, but I loved the whole like sub pop, Nirvana, all of the shit that came out around that time. The early 90s, late 80s into the early 90s was a great time for rock. In general, it was a great time for rock. A lot of really great rock music, alternative grunge, whatever the fuck you want to call it, came out. And among the greatest debut albums of all time, 10 by Pearl Jam. One of the most influential bands from Pearl Jam's era and from Nirvana, and a lot of those bands, Soundgarden, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, all those bands ripped off the first album of Boston. Boston's first album, 1976, one of the greatest debut albums of all time, one of the biggest selling records ever. In 1976, that album and Frampton Comes Alive were the biggest albums ever, and if the FBI broke into your house and checked your record collection and you didn't own Boston's first album or Frampton Comes Alive, you could be arrested and thrown in jail for up to 53 years. Boston's first album, amazing. Kurt Cobain completely ripped off More Than a Feeling for Smells Like Teen Spirit. It's the same riff. He ripped it off. He admitted it. Yes, I listened to, but it made people crazy. I remember when everybody's like, yeah, man, every corporate music sucks. Everything sucks, man. Yeah, Kurt Cobain. Then Cobain's like, yeah, you know what? I grew up listening Boston. The first Boston album is one of my favorite albums of all time. And Smells Like Teen Spirit, the riff, it's a complete rip-off of More Than a Feeling. And it is. Go if you never heard it, you don't recognize it, listen to Smells Like Teen Spirit, listen to the riff, and then listen to the riff of More Than a Feeling. It's exactly the same riff. Kurt Cobain ripped off Boston. And if you didn't know that, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but it's true. Kurt Cobain loved Boston. So Boston's first album, great one. Outlandos d'Amour, The Police. I mean, come on. 1978, that came out, late 78, early 79. The Police, one of my favorite bands of all time. They dominated my high school. One of the greatest bands of all time. I love every single album by The Police. Love them all. And Outlandos d'Amour, one of the greatest debut albums of all time by one of the greatest bands of all time. Outlandos, one of the greatest debut albums of all time. The Cars' first album. I mean, come on. What are we talking about? If you're making I think if you were to make the list of the top 5 greatest debut albums of all time, The Cars' first album is in that top 5, maybe near the top. It's one of the greatest, most consistently awesome debut albums of all time. Changed music as we knew it. New wave came in. I remember getting that album and Warren Zevon's Excitable Boy right around the same time. And I was into the heavy rock and the hard rock and all that shit, but I also loved Kiss. And I remember getting the Warren Zevon record and going, hey, this is really good and really cool. And then getting the Cars album the same year and going, oh, what's going on here? I've never heard this kind of music before. Really cool. It sounds like other stuff, but it doesn't, and it's really new. And those two albums, this is what I came to a realization was, especially after listening to Warren Zevon and then the Cars, I was like, oh, wait a minute, you know what? Kiss fucking sucks. Why have I listened to Kiss for the past 7 years? I'm an idiot. Yeah, I was 13 when those records came out, and I realized, among other things, that Warren Zevon is great and that the Cars' first album is amazing. I also realized, you know what? Boy, did I waste my time listening to shit like Kiss. Because Kiss sucks. The Cars, 1978, one of the greatest. The Clash, 1979. What can you say? One of the greatest and most important bands of all time. One of the most influential. One of the most daring. Seriously, historically. One of the most historic bands ever, The Clash. The Clash, 1979, their debut album, one of the greatest debut albums of all time. Are You Experienced, Jimi Hendrix? What can you say about that? What are you going to say about that? I don't think it's his best album. I don't think it's, Jimi Hendrix Experience, I don't think it's their best album. But certainly historic, important, groundbreaking, influential. Are You Experienced, one of the greatest debut albums of all time. What else do we got here? Let's see. We had that one already, this one, that one, and that. Okay. All right, 2 more here. Let me do my personal favorite. My personal favorite is Suzanne Vega's first album. Suzanne Vega, self-titled, from 1985. I remember listening to that record for the first time, and you know how much I love Suzanne Vega. I've caught a lot of videos talking about how important an artist she was to me. If you have not listened to episode 37 of the Nick D podcast at RadioMisfits.com, go back and listen to it. I got to interview Suzanne Vega, talk to her for almost an hour. Just saw her in concert at the beginning of May, 2 nights in a row. Hung out with her and talked to her afterwards in Evanston. She did my podcast, one of the best guests I've ever had. One of the most important, one of my favorite artists ever, one of my favorite humans that's ever lived on the planet. I adore Suzanne Vega, one of the greatest singers, songwriters, artists, poets, actresses, just people on the planet. I love her. And in my opinion, my favorite debut album of all time, Suzanne Vega's self-titled album from 1985. Remember listening to it, first song, first side, cracking. From that point on, loved it, obsessed with her. My favorite, from my opinion, the best debut album in the history of music, Suzanne Vega from 1985. But I would have to say that the debut album that blew everything up, the debut album that everybody went nuts for, that changed the face of music, the debut album that contained music on it that no one had ever heard before. It was like nothing that had ever been released before. And by the time that this record came out in 1978, I was already a massive rock fan, classic rock fan. I had been listening to the heavy stuff. I loved rock and roll. I loved hard rock. I loved heavy metal. I loved everything in that genre, the hard rock, heavy metal, rock and roll stuff. Loved it, heard it a million times, loved the influential and important artists, but nothing, and I mean nothing, sounded like Van Halen's first album. Van Halen's first album from 1978. Van Halen 1, as some people call it. The debut album of Van Halen, I think, historically, the most important debut album ever recorded, the most transcendent, the one that where you heard it, immediately you went, what the fuck is this? Eddie Van Halen, what's he doing with that guitar? Nobody's ever done anything like that with that instrument before. Nobody had done anything. The sounds that came out of that those speakers, when I first listened to that Van Halen record, every song is amazing. Every cut. There's not a bad cut on it. Everything worked on that record. All of the guys in the band, at that point, David Lee Roth was the best frontman ever. And that debut album, Van Halen 1, and I agree with me or not, you're wrong if you don't agree with me, especially if you weren't around when that record came out. Because when that record came out, everything changed. Nothing, and I mean nothing sounded like it. Nothing. So, historically, I think the most important, the most explosive, the most what the fuck are we listening to right now? Debut album of all time, without question. And not even close. Van Halen's first album from 1978. I mean, it's not even close. So, I have personal favorites, like my personal favorite is Suzanne Vega's first album. A lot of other incredible debut albums. I'm sure I've missed a bunch of them. I've probably missed more recent ones. You know, like The Strokes. A lot of people go, oh, The Strokes' first album. Yeah, okay, cool. So I probably missed a bunch of more recent ones because you know what? I'm old and I don't give a shit. But if you want to leave them here on the YouTube with your choices, especially if there are more recent debut albums that you think are important. Cool. Or more importantly, leave them on my Patreon page after you donate. Patreon.com/NickDShow. Donate now. And then leave your thoughts on the best debut albums of all time. Most of mine are older. I know that. You know why? Because I'm old and I don't give a shit. Okay? I'm an old man trying to get some wedges. I'm going to be 57 in a month. So anything, you know, like, oh, but their album from 2 years ago, the debut album by Shitbox or Hunt Heel or whatever bullshit from 2018, that's an amazing, I don't know it, I don't care. I don't give a fuck. Oh, Lady Gaga's first album came out in 2009. Good for Lady Gaga. I'd rather listen to the first Van Halen record. Thank you. So, debut albums. Which ones? Greatest debut records of all time. Making a statement your first time at bat. Woo! Okay. Hey, I got more videos coming up, more podcasts, and if you want to, you want to listen to it, you want to do that, subscribe, it's free. Tell your mom, tell your uncle, I know he's a dick, tell him anyway.